I won't name them, but I'm sure you can guess some of them, where economic independence is and a science career is the only opportunity for personal independence. Girls do much better than boys. And now the NAPLAN. So in Australia, the annual assessment of students in years 3, 5, 7 and 9. Assessment of reading and writing and spelling and grammar and numeracy. Notice that there's no science there, unfortunately. Now, it differs from a national assessment held in other countries, like you'll read in the book, the SAT or the NAP. So it's a census-based approach. We sample everyone, with the exception of, people who are, conscientious objectors. They don't send the kids that day. So it's, most countries, they just use a stratified sampling approach. And it tests individual students' attainment of educational milestones in literacy and numeracy. So there's curriculum standards rather than facts and figures. So it's not like we're memorising stuff. It's whether you meet that proficiency standard, so criterion referenced. So competencies. So is it a formative or a summative assessment? Here's where the room goes really quiet. Does anyone want to volunteer an answer? No one brave enough? Yes, we've got someone.
Is it a formative?
Well, if it was a formative, it would be ongoing assessment and you would get feedback throughout the course of your grade. So in this case, it's actually a summative assessment. A formative one would be things like a take-home test, a practice exam, something that didn't actually count. And what type of norming is this? Is it norm referenced or criterion referenced? Well, Erin, up the back. Very much so, because it's based on whether they meet that proficiency standard. Very good. So it's actually criterion referenced rather than comparing to norms. Now here's an example of some Year 5 questions. So this is about the spelling. Now we identify the spelling error, but they've got to actually give the correct spelling. I'm not going to write answers here. I'm hoping you could actually do these one. If you can't, I would be really worried. Let's have a look at this one. This is a test of grammar. Now, some of these are a little bit harder. I had to just think just a little bit about number 27. Bends her knees before she's... And initially I thought, oh, she's. And then I thought, no, that's not right. It's she shoots. So some of these, and they get harder by the Year 9, of course. It really ramps up in difficulty. But it's a thorough testing, but it's just not testing that deeper level. The advantage, though, is that we get a spelling test and a grammar test and a reading test and a writing test all for the price of one. So most educational assessments just measure reading alone. So you may have heard last week in the media, Queensland students performed below the national average, sounding like a really bad thing, and some really sensationalist headlines. Might be very demoralising for a lot of the teachers who lack a statistics background to actually look at the evidence. Our journalists certainly lack a science background to look at the evidence, so they just read whatever the press officer from the minister tells them to say. But you as psychology-trained graduates, you can actually evaluate the performance yourself in a way that a journalist or a teacher or a parent could not. So let's have a look at Queensland versus national performance. Now, I'm not going to pick every grade or every subject. I'm just going to do reading and numeracy, and we're going to look at Year 9, because that's the end point. We should see the biggest gaps there. So let's have a look at reading. You all know about effect size and t-test. You would plug those numbers into an effect size calculator. Don't do it in your head, it's too hard. Just on the web. I did that late last night at about 9 o'clock. The effect size, negative 0.14. So we do score a little bit lower. But how big of an effect is that? So remember Cohen's cutoffs, 0.2 is a small, 0.5 is medium, 0.8 is a large. It's not at the small level, it's about half of what we would call small. So it's almost to the point of being trivial. It's certainly not something we should be losing sleep over, berating principals for, and then berating teachers for, who are then just going to pass that stress on to our children. Let's have a look at numeracy. Effect size even smaller, 0.11. So we generally define trivial as 0.10. So it really is very much a trivial effect. But you wouldn't have learnt that from looking at the headlines. They sounded big, bad, scary. Frightened a lot of teachers, a lot of principals, and a lot of parents who are concerned for the well-being of their kids. One thing you will have heard too about the online assessment. Now, I've only got the stats for last year. They haven't released much information this year, but 15% of students completed their NAPLAN assessment online, and it used computer adaptive testing. Now, they're blaming that, but there's some controversy over whether the results are directly comparable. Now, last year's results for NAPLAN online are still censored. The Minister has not released them to the... All the other data I've got access to still haven't released it. And last year in the headlines, state education ministers, they were not signing off on it. They did not think it was directly comparable. So the national data reported did not include the NAPLAN online scores. Now, surprisingly, test performance for the writing test at least was substantially higher than the main assessment. So students did better with the computer. Can anyone think why? Well, technology is a factor. Kids love technology.
Don't have to do so many small, frustrating questions.
Yes, so there's definitely a reduction there. But for the writing task, it was just prose writing. So why might we do better on a computer than we do with a paper and pencil? Up the back. We had a response, we're probably able to read it clearer. I think that's probably the reason. Particularly boys with their handwriting, generally significantly poorer, that it is easier for people to mark and they got higher marks. But also too, if you have trouble with fine motor control, which a lot of boys do, a lot of young children do, it's easier to type. And in fact, we actually have educational accommodations for people in university to allow them to type, because it allows them to just sort of levels the playing field effectively, and they can express themselves more fluently. So I'm particularly interested, given there's a gender difference in writing, I really want to see whether it reduced. Now, I don't really care about the actual averages, I care about the difference between the males and the female. I suspect, particularly with the handwriting issue, that that's a really strong factor. But again, they have yet to release the data. Okay, so computer adaptive testing, see Chapter 8, page 243 to 246. But the next item offered is tailored to give the maximal additional information. So if we know you're already getting the answers right, we give you harder items. So it maximises discrimination. And traditional graded tests have items from very easy to hard that everyone takes, whereas CAT, it's a significant reduction in time. So you're not wasting that extra time on it. And again, it's just no excuse for me to throw in a CAT picture. Okay, but you need to understand how CAT works. So routing tests direct the examinee to the appropriate level of difficulty. What do we call that appropriate level of difficulty in an IQ test? We call it the basal level. So in an IQ test, we do that manually by adjusting the content. But here for computing, we actually have branching. Now, different test takers get different items tailored to their level. So teachers and parents might not see it as equal. They might offer resistance to that. Serious issue is not all schools are adequately resourced. In fact, in NAPLAN Online, they encourage students to bring their own device because they didn't trust the devices that the schools were able to provide. And in fact, network connectivity was a serious issue. They were breaking down partway through. They'd have to restart the test. So that's a problem too. It requires hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items tested on thousands of examinees to determine what we call the item characteristic curve. Remember the ICCs? It uses item response theory, IRT. As a revision, go back and have a look at page 166 to 167. That makes it expensive, time-consuming to ensure comparability. We're not sure if they're compatible yet. And it also needs public buy-in, acceptance testing by educators, parents, and in particular policymakers. So right now, the buy-in is in the crapper. They do not trust it. So that's an issue. But the benefits of CAT NAPLAN is that you'll have more precise measurement of student ability. It minimises those floor and ceiling effects, so greater differentiation. Greater test taker engagement. As Lockie said, kids love technology. We have so much technology, why not use it? Get the kids on side. Less frustration too at the lower end. This is what really bothers me, I guess, about standardised testing is that for the low achieving student who has to sit there for 2 or 3 hours answering questions that are progressively harder and they have not even a chance of getting, imagine what that must do to their self-esteem. Now, hopefully none of you are in that boat, but imagine if you were a child and you were doing tests that you couldn't possibly answer, what that might make you feel like. It also has the potential to reduce anxiety, as kids are told that, you know, it'll be adapted to your ability level, so you don't need to worry so much. And then they start getting easier questions and they feel better and, you know, certainly a better outcome. Now, here's to have a look at the gender differences in NAPLAN data. Now, this is unpublished, but it's data from, I think, 2008, the first year, to 2018. So it's a decade's worth of data, averaged across years. So if we have a look here, that line there, that's a effect size of 0.2, so a small effect. So by the end stage, there's not much of a gap in our reading, but it's still, there's a small gender difference. So girls do better than boys. But if you have a look at the writing effect, it's twice the size. That's really troubling. What happens when those boys go into university and they have to write an essay or a lab report? So that's not a good outcome. Spelling, it's definitely above the small level and it increases as they go through. In fact, there's a developmental trend for most of these here. And grammar too. Grammar is really important for writing. So you know, there are a lot of grammar errors in people's written work. We can rely on the grammar checker for some of it, but often it will choose the wrong option. It's not perfect yet, AI. So, you know, that's concerning as well. But this in particular, this writing gap is really bad. Okay, so are there gender differences in reading, writing? Well, are they just peculiar to NAPLAN? Is Australia the oddball? Well, to answer that, we'd have to look internationally. PISA studies suggest a reading gap present across all tested countries, but they don't test writing ability. One of the only tests that does in the United States is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP. So just published, we did a meta-analysis and we found similarly large effect sizes favouring girls and women in reading and in writing. So this is what it looked like. A developmental trend towards larger gender gaps with age. No decrease across time, so we're not making any improvements, at least in America, suggesting that the gap is really pervasive. One of the reasons, I think, is that we never really examined gender differences in writing, so we didn't really know how bad they were. So that was the APA, they put out a press release about it. You'll have to excuse me for self-citing, but it was one of the only studies that really looked at a gender difference in writing. And so this is what the gender gap in reading looked like, very much like ours. So ranging from the very small to quite large. So it's a little bit worse in the USA than it is in Australia. We do better here. But for writing, it was really huge. So at 0.8, that's a large effect. And that was what we found in the older students. So it's a really serious problem. It's not peculiar to Australia. And in fact, I think we probably do a better job in Australia with achieving educational parity, but we still have a long way to go. So I might break it there, and we'll give you a 5-minute break, and then we'll hit it hard and try to get through the rest of the material. So before the break, we were just about to start on the example of credentialing. I'm going to go through the National Psychology exam. There are other exams for other fields, of course, but I think that this one will probably be more interesting to you if there are people here that might have aspirations to become a psychologist. So it was introduced from July 2014. The reason why is we could not trust all of the universities, and I'm not going to name them, that were issuing psychology degrees. So the goal of the national exam is to ensure a consistent professional standard of psychologists nationally. So you can complete your honours, do your supervised practice, or you could complete your honours and do a master's, and you could still not be able to register as a psychologist. Now, this exam, it is tough. It is brutal, in fact. So it's 150 multiple choice questions, and it's 3.5 hours in duration. So no breaks, 3.5 hours. So don't think for a moment that these are easy questions. You just go tick, tick, tick a minute on each one. They're generally in the form of a vignette or a scenario. This is the situation, what would be the appropriate steps? So this is the breakdown. And you can see the percentage weighting here. Assessment is worth 30%. So this course, 30% of the exam. But we also cover ethics, 30%. So that's a pretty high weighting. Now, one of the things students really struggle on, not because they're bad people, but are ethical codes, because they're so complex and you've got to memorise it and really know it and understand the principles. Interventions is another one, 30%. And then actually writing reports, that's about 10%, so a relatively small amount. But here's the kicker, you need a 70% to pass. So unless you get 70%, you can't register as a psychologist. You can take the exam again the next year, but you're not going to be practicing as a psychologist. So it's pretty tough. This is what we would call a criterion reference test. Now, understanding of issues in test selection, use and interpretation, acceptability and appropriateness. Things like test reliability, validity, utility, standardisation. Also your ability to administer, score, interpret and write reports using current editions of psychometric tests. So, what type of tests? Well, you have to know the WAIS, Weschler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the WISC, Weschler Intelligence Scale for Children. You also need to know Personality Assessment Inventory and the DAS, Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale. So one of the things that I often recommend to students is go have a look at the DAS, use that on your survey if you've got depression or anxiety on your nomological network, because at least that's one test you can then administer. And you might not even be a psychologist, you might be a mental health worker, caseworker, you can still administer the DAS. That's freely available online. I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to just download it when you've got some free time and just get proficient in scoring it, because it's a really useful skill set to have under your belt. You don't need to memorise these, but you have to know all these other tests. So when I say you don't need to memorise, I mean you today don't. You would if you sat the exam. So the strong interest, self-directed search, which we'll do in a moment, vocational ones, the Woodcock-Johnson ones, we've got the Stanford-Binet at the top, we've got the Beck Depression Inventory, we've got the NEO, the 16 personality factors, MMPI-2, all the sort of things that we've been covering in this course. Now, one other piece of terminology, we've gone through formative and summative. The difference between aptitude versus achievement. So aptitude is about assessment of future learning potential, how you would do in the future. So specific aptitude tests like the differential aptitude test or perhaps an IQ test. It's used for career guidance and school to career transition. And they actually have specific vocational norms for individual subtests. It's actually a really good test. Then there's the achievement test. That's based on demonstrated ability, more like your crystallised intelligence. So you can see more there on page 328. So standardised testing like NAPLAN, like PISA, etc. Here's an example of a test report, just one of those ones that Pearson issues for the differential aptitude test. So on a test of abstract reasoning, John scored here at the 58th percentile. So across different tests, John will do better and worse. So here, this is identified that John is really advanced. He's equivalent to the 90th percentile on mechanical reasoning. Doing a test like this might be useful if John doesn't know what career he should go into. Not a lot of kids don't. Heck, there's a lot of people that enroll in university and change degrees. There may be some of you who are thinking of pursuing other degrees. So, getting vocational guidance early on is really critical, and that's one of the purposes of educational assessment, to provide that guidance. Other specific aptitude tests, the GAMSAT, that's used for selection in medical degrees, the UMAT for dentistry. In America, the Scholastic Aptitude Test for college entry. Now, they don't tell you, but this is an IQ test. It's an IQ test by stealth. It would seem sinister if we were to tell you it's an IQ test, but it's really measuring your fluid reasoning, your ability to perform in the future. Now, there's an extremely large gender gap there for the mathematics component, the SAT-M. But very few males actually complete it, and most females do the SATs. So we have a selection bias here, and that actually explains a lot of the gap in it, because only males who know they want to do engineering or mathematics or science do the SAT-M, but most women, when they graduate high school, will go on to college. So there's a big gender gap in male-female educational attainment in America. So more women sit the exam, so that's an issue. The Queensland Core Skills Test, well, we've seen here there's a correlation, but it's not a huge correlation, and there's lots of other factors that explain your GPA other than your OP score. Now, general aptitude tests, effectively they're intelligence tests, as I mentioned. They tend to tap fluid abilities, or what we call psychometric G, far more than they do crystallised abilities. It's also used to assess intellectual impairment at one end of the spectrum or intellectual giftedness at the other. So diagnosis of intellectual impairment also requires significant interference with what we call adaptive functioning. So it's not just at school that they're having trouble socially, they're having trouble at home, and those sorts of difficulties. That is one of the criteria for intellectual impairment, that it's not situation specific. Diagnosis of giftedness is really important to identify students who are underperforming, and often they do, they just coast because they can get away with it, due to boredom and a lack of academic engagement. And so then you can actually work with them to try to improve that academic engagement, or maybe increase the complexity to a point where they're intellectually stimulated. Achievement tests, as I mentioned, are more crystallised. Okay, so it's crystallised past learning, school learning, more than fluid. So have a look at page 331 to 332. So education and intelligence are two different things. And it's used to assess and diagnose what we call a specific learning disorder, like reading impairment, dyslexia, writing impairment, dysgraphia, or numeracy, dyscalculia. And is often combined with aptitude IQ tests to identify patterns of strengths and weaknesses. Someone who is dyslexic, that doesn't mean that they're stupid. In fact, they sometimes actually score higher. There's this weird effect where a lot of dyslexias actually score higher in intelligence. But what's holding them back is the ability to read. So if you can solve that problem for them or work with them, you can dramatically improve their educational outcomes. But if you don't do the IQ test, you'll never know how much potential they had. So intelligence tests were covered last week. You know, the WIPSI, the WISC, the WACE, stand for Binet. There's some tests that combine both, so achievement and aptitude. The Woodcock-Johnson 4 suite. So they have the cognitive abilities, the aptitude component, and they have the achievement. They also have an oral language component. So if their oral language skills are good, but their reading is poor, that tells you that they probably have dyslexia, and that's useful information. Now, the name of the test is the Woodcock-Johnson. So Johnson, if you don't already know, is an American name, it's slang, and so is Woodcock. So we'll get our laughs out of the way, and then we'll move on. And I will try not to snigger as well, but it is really poorly named. So it's more closely aligned with CHC model than with the Weschler test. So it has that extra component of reading, writing, quantitative reasoning, and provides scores on broad stratum abilities based on these their subtests. So it provides a more comprehensive assessment than the WISC, 10 subtests in the standard battery and 18 in the extended. So the advantage, though, of this test is they're very short. About 5 minutes per subtest. So around 60 minutes for the standard battery, longer for the extended. So you get a broader picture than with the WISC. Why do we not use the WISC, the Woodcock? Well, people are trained on the WISC. So that's what they generally go with. But there's definitely some advantages to the Woodcock one. Have a look on page 348, 349, and in particular, figure 10.4. Okay, so we can see here some of the CHC factors here and the ones that are measured. So across the board, all of these tests pretty much measure most of the ones that we would be interested in. We've got quantitative reasoning here. We've got auditory memory, numeric facility, cognitive efficiency. We've got visual processing, long-term memory, whereas I think the Weschler's more sort of a short-term. We've got fluid, we've got general knowledge, and we've got our GF and GC here. So it's a really useful test. And in particular, here are the CHC factors that they're covering. Again, that just shows you some of the tests. You don't have to memorise these, but you should be aware of the broad CHC factors that it does test. Okay. Like the Weschler family of IQ tests, a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15. It's normed for 2 to 99 years. So very young to very old, one test. That's handy. You don't have to do a separate WIPC and then a WISC and then a WACE. So you can just be proficient in one. And they have Australian norms for 5 to 15-year-old. So that would definitely cover primary school onward. But you should always question the psychometric soundness of a test. So let's have a look at it. Reliability. Well, coefficients ranging from 0.8 to higher than 0.9 across subtests. I remember 0.9 was the gold standard for making high-stakes decisions about individuals. It has a small standard error of measurement, which is nice, because that means our confidence intervals, when we write up that report, are going to be narrower. We can be more sure than perhaps with another test. But let's have a look at the validity evidence. It has convergent validity, which means it correlates strongly at the 0.8, 0.9 level with the WACE, General Intelligence Score, with the verbal WACE and the performance WACE. So ranging from 0.74 to 0.84. So that's not doing too bad. And it has a similar strength for the WIPC and the WISC and the SB5. So general achievement tests are used to assess learning disabilities, to be useful as a diagnostic tool. And again, because these are high-stakes decisions, this will determine whether they're denied access to educational support. You want to have reliabilities greater than 0.90. Any achievement test should have an alignment with either the DSM-5 criteria or the ICD equivalent. So you can see here, if you click on that link, the diagnosis for a specific learning disorder. And it should have alignment with theoretical models of achievement in those domains, like theories of reading and reading development, theories of reading disability, etc. That's an example of a theoretical model. You don't have to memorise it, we'll move on. But, you know, these are some of the deficits that a child might have in their phonological processing skills. So you would want to have an element of phonics tested as well as single word reading. So you know what type of deficit, where the deficit lies. Now, aptitude and IQ tests, aptitude and achievement tests, often we administer them concurrently, so it's really handy when you're developing the test to do what you call co-norming. So co-norming is when you administer 2 or more tests, like an IQ and an achievement test, and you compare across both of them. So the Weschler Individual Achievement Test, or the WIAT, that's a test of achievement from the Weschler family. It's co-normed with the WISC. And the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement is co-normed with the Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive Abilities test. So then you can see performance across both of them. Why use co-norming? Well, recruitment of a sample is the most challenging and expensive part of test development because you want to make sure it's representative of the general population. It reduces the cost of developing 2 normative samples separately, and it also allows for comparison across tests and in particular factor analysis. So can you differentiate between specific abilities and show that they hold factorial validity? That should be a term that you're familiar with. So does it load just against that factor or against some other ones? So don't be confused by the name. The Woodcock-Johnson 4 test of achievement is different to the Woodcock-Johnson 4 test of cognitive abilities. So it has 11 subtests across 4 domains: reading, mathematics, writing and academic. And it's a separate test to the Woodcock-Johnson 4 that includes an oral language component. And it's used for diagnosis, eligibility for services, school placement, and these intervention decisions. But it can also be used with universities, students and adults. So you might be surprised, but there are learning disorders that affect adults as well. So we use it to better understand the achievement levels of college students or adults. It can be used in an assessment program for students with learning difficulty or students that are struggling. Now, up to 5% of university students, for example, have dyslexia. So that oral learning, the oral learning, that's actually really useful because if it's higher than their reading learning, then that tells you that there could be some sort of reading impairment there. So that's something useful to know. Now you'll see here for the achievement test, we've got a reading test, we've got a mathematics test, a writing test, and then across multiple domains. So there's an awful lot of things here, these subtests, that just aren't tested in the Weschler test. So again, we get a more detailed picture. Now, the individual achievement test, it's used to, sorry, that should be, yeah, the WIAT. No, yeah, the Weschler is the, yeah, sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, the Weschler individual achievement test is very similar to the Woodcock-Johnson, but what it doesn't do is quite as much detail. So it has 16 subtests across 4 domains: reading, written language, oral language, mathematics, but it doesn't have the scientific component. Provides a total achievement score and a separate score for each domain. The good news is it does have that oral language component, which is really good for spotting dyslexia. The WIAT is also used for diagnosis, eligibility for services, interventions, just like the Woodcock-Johnson test would. Okay, and you can see there the different subtests. So word reading, pseudo-word decoding, that's for phonological skills, reading comprehension, and then mathematics, and you've got written language. So why is diagnosis and verification important? Well, it might be required to gain access to a particular school or to a gifted and talented program within that school, or perhaps to gain a scholarship. So it's really useful to have these for the upper end of the ability scale. But it might also be needed for entry to schools for special needs. So you need a formal diagnosis. It might be needed for children in mainstream education, which, you know, a lot of people will argue is a better option. You just provide them additional support. But we can't give that additional support to everyone, so we need an actual diagnosis as the cut-off. So if you click there, there's the policy document on the verification for educational adjustment program. So, for example, if a child has ADHD, we might give them rest breaks during an exam. That might be one educational accommodation. Educational accommodations, adjustments and accelerations in mainstream settings often occur too, like universities. So we have the Disability Services Officer who makes a determination based on the medical evidence that's presented to them whether students need an alternate exam setting. And many students do. You know, it's often test anxiety. So sitting in a quiet room rather than a big crowded lecture hall, that makes it less stressful. It may be that they have a reading impairment, so they need additional time during perusal. So that's not like they're getting extra time on the exam, but just in the perusal time. Or it might mean that they need rest breaks. So we have, you know, a large number of students who meet that criteria. We as conveners never know what the reason is, but, you know, we recognise the need for making those accommodations, because if we don't, what would happen is, you remember that classical test theory? X equals your true score plus E, they would be sources of random error that would affect particular students and serve to lower their performance. This is a definition, you don't need to memorise it, but the difference between gifted and talented. Gifted students are more that fluid reasoning, whereas talented, they have specific strengths, like mathematics or like science or something like that. And often they do quite overlap as well. One thing we will just briefly cover, and you touch more on this in abnormal psychology, that deficits in intellectual functioning are required for an intellectual impairment diagnosis, and it has to be confirmed both by clinical assessment and an IQ test. So you don't just trust the IQ test, you also do a full assessment. You know, what's their functioning at home, what's their functioning at school, etc.